Hello, and welcome back to the Hunter Chronicles. This is the episode 6. In previous videos, namely episode 4, I talked about there being alternate interpretations for the events of the morning of September 30 in and about 6 a.m. And in this video, I present an overview of those interpretations. Now, I've already stated my preference for the interpretation that I've worked with and that with Hunter and I both agreed upon, but there are at least two other interpretations which are very viable, and they'll center around the events in the lock interrogation report which are ambiguous. Namely, that you have two rooms, and each room has events going on it in the time frame from 6:12 to 2:05 p.m. That'd be 6:12 a.m. in the morning. And because there is a 1-minute resolution on the lock interrogation report events, you cannot tell which events came first, either the events in room 135 or the events in room 134 when they both occur in the same minute. And so that's what this video is all about. Now, I'm not going to delve into the extreme detail. I'm not going to delve into the pros and cons of each theories, because that in and of itself warrants an entire video. And delving into the exacting details of the lock interrogation report also requires another video. But I will give you enough information to evaluate these theories at a superficial level and to make yourself aware of them. So with that, let's let this video run. I've got the pre-recorded graphic interface, and I'm just going to explain it as it comes along. All right. As stated, we're going to be dealing with the time frame between 6:12 a.m. through 14:05 p.m. on the 30th of September. And we're going to be asking the question, are there viable alternate interpretations of the events in the lock interrogation report? Now, you'll recall that immediately prior to 6:12 a.m., Paddock had gone through a series of events where he'd acquired 4 more cards for 2 different rooms, and he'd gone through, he'd been hauling 2 rolly cases, probably full of ammunition, and he'd had to go up and down the elevator twice and visit the VIP counter twice because, for whatever reason, he was without cards to access room 134 or room 135. As the case is, room 134 he had left padlocked, and so there was no way to get into it even if he had the card for it, which he did not. And room 135 had been left unlocked, and therefore the appropriate card should have gained him access. But he didn't have one, so he had to gather one. And the first one he got was for room 134, and the second one he got was for room 135. Now, in my interpretation, my preferred interpretation, I assert that Paddock drug his suitcases through the door and basically immediately left the room for parts unknown. But in this video, we're going to examine what other things are also possible. To answer these questions, we're going to look at each 1-minute block of events in the LIR, and we're going at least ways for the 6:12 to 2:05 p.m. frame. And we're going to look at all those blocks, and we're going to look at them for the room 135, 134, and then we're going to combine them, and we're going to examine them collectively. And of course, you know, the underlying question that's the elephant in the room is, can one person acting alone produce the events for both rooms as presented in the LIR? Now, some would argue that there were multiple people involved. I am not in this video. There's no evidence on the table. Evidence is a bad word. There's no information on the table at the moment to suggest that at this time frame there were multiple people involved in this room. It would be pure speculation on my part to assert that. So we have to figure out somehow that Paddock acting alone can generate all the events in both rooms. And so we have to trace his pathing through the rooms and try to figure out what really happened. To do that, we're going to look at lots and lots of information. And one of the pieces that we'll look at here will be a 2-week overview of Paddock's whereabouts, because we can get a good idea from this, at least roughly anyway, what his habits and patterns are. And we see that on the 30th, from this 2-week overview, that his habit changed because, number one, he didn't gamble, and number two, the sleep period here, which, if you believe my interpretation originally, he didn't sleep. And also, in the afternoon, he started doing these little walkabouts to go visit the Luxor and perhaps engage in conversations with an Asian lady. So, and you can also see some other things from here, but it's not going to become relevant at this point in time. If we take this 2-week overview and we turn it into a more precise timing, i.e. accurate time scale, for just the 7 days that he stayed in the Mandalay Bay Hotel, this is the type of chart that gets produced. And I did this because so much of the information, namely the storyboard that I have and the other charts and graphs I have, don't really lay out a true perspective of what happened when, because so many events, particularly those from the LIR, are just tiny in time duration compared to the rest of the day. For example, if you take a look here on the let's go to the 30th, since that's the day we'll be looking at. You'll see these little blue lines here, and those little blue lines indicate where the elevator ride center core took place. Of the little green lines indicate when he was in the valet exiting, and so you can see, and the purple lines down here indicate Self Park. So as you can see, those are pretty significant events, but in terms of how much time they took up during the day, they're fairly minuscule. So that's why I have this type of chart in my pocket to look at, to remind me, how the day really and truly is broken down in terms of the real hours spent. And if we take the 30th and expand that out somewhat to accommodate these alternate theories that I'm going to come up with here, we can take a look at the 30th, and we can see several things happening in a little bit greater detail because it's blown up a little bit. The first thing I want to bring your attention to is the time frame. It's from 6:12 a.m. in the morning till 14:05. Those are the only lock interrogation events we're going to be examining. We'll consider what happened before and what happens after, but in detail we're only going to look at the lock interrogation report events in this time frame. And of course, the lock interrogation report doesn't tell the whole story. You have to look at, the videos. You have to look at a storyboard. You have to look at the other parts of the FIT report, and lay them into the overlay them on top of the lock interrogation report events to figure out what's going on. So for the 30th, in the time frame that we're looking at, we can see that we're going to be developing 3 major theories, and I'll get into those in a little bit. But what I wanted to point out from this chart is that there are other things that we have to consider. For example, there was a minibar service at around noon. A fellow came in and serviced the minibar. Took him about 15 minutes, and that was in room 134. We also have to consider that somewhere along the lines the staff got a hold of Paddock and asked him if he wanted to have his room cleaned, and that was denied. He said no, he didn't. We also have to take into consideration the FIT report asserting that after 12:15, little after noon, that he placed the do not disturb signs on. Well, it doesn't really say for the do not disturb sign who said that, or what testimony it was from, or what time they were actually placed. It just says after 12:15. Okay, well, how do they know that that happened? It's always been a nagging question, and that's indicated by the little aqua colored box here. The room cleaning wanting change happened between 1 and 2 p.m. in the afternoon. And then, of course, there is testimony that Paddock ate at the noodle bar. And based upon each of these theories that I'll be presenting, there are different opportunities to do so. And because the time isn't specified in the FIT report, we kind of have to wing it here. Okay, the other things you can ask about the noodle bar. Sorry, there's a train going by here. Let me just hold on. All right, I can talk over the cars going by. Was he really alone at the noodle bar? There's two conflicting testimony. One says that he ate with an Asian woman that looked a lot like Danley, but some people view that as being non-credible testimony because the woman got the day wrong. And then that woman specifies the time, and she asserts that it was a little afternoon. Whereas there's another fellow who says, yes, Paddock ate there, but he ate alone. It was on the 30th, but they didn't specify the time or who gave it or provide his actual testimony. Okay, and then on the minibar. The minibar was serviced a little afternoon. You have to ask several different questions. Who ordered it refreshed? Did Paddock order it up, and why? Or was it simply because of the sensors on the minibar that somebody automatically serviced it? And if that's the case, what was replaced or what was used? Was it one cookie in the snack portion, or was it 20 bottles of liquor, which would have pretty radically different consequences and interpretations. All right. And of course, in terms of staff contacting him for the room clean, you have to ask how they contacted him. Was it by phone or in person? But either way, he had to be awake to do that. All right, so you can see that this time between 6:12 and 14:05 is actually a pretty large chunk of the entire day. And even though it contains relatively few events in the lock interrogation report, it still is a pretty significant portion of the overall picture, and which theory anybody adopts can have a pretty radical impact on the remainder of the interpretation. All right, so here again we lay out to the left of the screen here that same chart with less pieces shown and less notations. And we're going to talk about the lock interrogation report activity now. And we start with room 135. And room 135 had 3 1-minute blocks of lock interrogation report indicated here by the blue with the times indicated. There was a single minute, not a single event, but a single minute at 6:12, again at 6:13, and again at 2:05 p.m. And in between, there's a huge gap of time. And it is that gap of time that's going to be the question of the theories. So in this case, we have 3 blocks, and that's for room 135. And then we have what happened in room 134. In this case, we have 4 blocks, one at 6:13. The barkeep came in at 5 minutes after noon. Then we have activity again at 2:05 p.m. and 2:06 p.m. So for the time block of 6:13, there's activity in both room 135 and room 134. And again, we have activity at 2:05 p.m. for both rooms. And these are things that pose problems. And we have to look at how we can arrange these time blocks, what's in them, is there a preferred sequence, are there constraints and requirements that can be imposed on them to sort them out, whatever. But the ultimate question is, which block comes first? And then over here to the right, we combine all the events, and presuming, of course, that Paddock did it all with the exception of the barkeep. This is one possible interpretation of the events. Now, in this case, I placed the events here from 135 first, and down below at 205, the events from 135 second. And I labeled this block up here of these ambiguous minute time frames as A, and these down here as block B. And these are going to be referred to in the future diagrams, so you need to remember those. So this whole sequence of events would be referred to as sequence A1. All right. The other three blocks, namely at 612, 1205, and 1406, there's no ambiguity. And that's common to all the theories, and all theories have to account for the activity in those blocks. They're fixed in time, namely they're invariant. There's no ambiguity. Well, I shouldn't say there's no ambiguity. There's no doubt about when they took place. What the actual content means is a whole different story. Okay. So, block A is ambiguous. Both rooms had activity during this time, and we have to try to determine which came first. And again, block 1, same situation. So now, in this case, there are some requirements that we can apply. In the case of block from room 134 at 2:05 p.m., that requires that there be a person in the hallway, and I'll explain why in a minute. And then similarly for room 135, it requires that there be someone on the inside room. So those two constraints there will have an impact on the possible interpretations. Okay, so here we are. We moved this hold up picture over to the left. And now we're going to take these blocks, and since there are two blocks blocks A and 1, and each has two LIR event time frames in it, if we shuffle them up here in A, we get a second column, and we're going to enumerate all the possible combinations of these ambiguous blocks. And because there are two for each, that we end up with 4 combinations. And this is what they'll look like. And you can see where, if you shuffle the 613 block down and put the 135 first, you get, now let's just explain this. If you take sequence A1 and you move the 135 block below the 134 block, then you get sequence B1. And namely, the lower portion hasn't changed, only portion has changed is the ordering of these two little time frames up there. Similarly, if you take block 1 and reverse the ordering of room 134 and 135, you get block 2, and this sequence would be called B2. And then the fourth and final one would be where we again shuffle the ordering of the AB block by getting room 135 first. Then we would come up with sequence A2. So these are all the combinations that are possible with those two sets of ambiguous blocks, each with 2 possibilities. And we'll be looking at these individually and collectively. And, well, let's just go ahead. Let's move forward. What do they mean, basically? So now I introduce another graph, or chart, if you will. This chart is not to scale. That is, on the left we have a time scale accurate clock chart, but this one is not. This one is more in your face to present the emphasis or impact or influence of each of the events that occurred. And this is what I was talking about earlier. Sometimes I want to know what took place down to the minute, where it was throughout the day, and sometimes I want to, be reminded which things are important. So, for example, here we have, the barkeep is a pretty prominent graphic going across that little chart there, but in reality, down here on the left, in a true time scale, it's just a little blip. And similarly, for example, the time between when he potentially left the room. Anyway, let's see, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, almost 6 hours there of time between, when he arrived at the room at 6 something, and then again until the minibar arrives. But over here, it's not proportionally spaced. And so both types of charts are useful, but they have different purposes. Now in this, we've already paid attention to the time accurate chart. In this one, what we're looking at, well, I'm going to describe that in more detail here coming up, so there's really no need to. This is the correspondence between the two. All right. This is not only the influence chart, as I call it, but also a little bit more detailed, where you take, in the influence chart, you'll see that there are these blue squares, and those represent the blocks which are ambiguous. So for example, prior to that, up there when he was testing all the cards, there's a couple of events in the lock interrogation report which are ambiguous because there's events for both room 135 and 134 occurring at the same time. And then again down here, this is the 1 and 2 block, and there's ambiguous events there. So the blue square around it indicates there's ambiguous lock interpretation timing. On this chart you can see other things too, but I have in back of it what was happening with the deadbolts. So for example, the purple indicates that room 134 was deadbolted prior to his arrival, and then it became undeadbolted, but then he deadbolted room 135 for the entire time that we are investigating, and so on and so forth. And then there's a bunch of other little things in here which I will explain in upcoming slide. I bring your attention now to the expansion of this first set of ambiguous time blocks, namely the A block from the lock interrogation report, which consists of 2 sets of events. One for room 135, on the A block, and that's with the little gray things. This is the A block. On the right is the B block. So the A block consists of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5 events for room 135, and 1, 2, 3 events for room 134. And the B block consists of the same events, only the order is reversed. Similarly, down at the 1 and 2 blocks, you'll have the same scenario. Now, I'm not listing them out in detail here because it doesn't all fit on one page, and for this overview we don't really need to know but a couple of things, and we'll talk about those in a minute. So on this chart we have all the events listed for both rooms 134 and 135 for the time frame starting at 6:13, and there's a grand total of 8 events. There's also this weird ass event here called the Inside Open. I'm not going to get into a discussion in this video about it, but it warrants a pretty intense look at what's going on there. Okay, let's move on to the next chart. Now in this one I take the upper portion of the influence diagram, the portion that contains the time frame that we're looking at this evening, and I label what all the pieces are. And in here you'll notice that between the doors event and the cards event, we have 3 columns. Each one of those represents a different viable theory. The one in the left here, he stays in his room and potentially sleeps. He stays in his room from 6:13 till the time frame of these first events, which is 2:05. And the barkeep comes and goes in room 134, and nobody's the wiser. The second interpretation is he stays in the room and sleeps until the barkeep comes, and then he escapes with the barkeep via room 134 into the hallway. Then he goes for parts unknowns, and maybe he had a noodle lunch sometime in the afternoon there. In the third one, which is my preferred theory, he left the room at 6:13 and did not return again until 2:05 p.m., both leaving and entering via room 134. So, if you read this chart, or the theories, and let's start with mine, you can see the little block right there that shows the, oh, that's interesting, why don't the, I should have connecting, there we go, connecting lines. Back to this column over here, which is mine. He exited the room 134 after deadbolting room 135 and went into the hallway and went for parts unknown, as I said. And so that requires block A, or event or sequence A, to occur. And because of that, when he returns at 2:05, there's only one block that can, or one sequence that can happen there, and that is 1. So for my theory to work, the order of the blocks have to be as they were presented in block A and block 1. There's only one ordering that will work for my theory. For a theory that he stayed in the room, the block ordering at the top essentially doesn't matter, but since he's in the room, when he finishes nap or whatever the heck he's doing, the first event that occurs must be from block 2. Okay, and then if you take the hybrid approach, which is exiting with the barkeep, essentially at the top it doesn't matter what the ordering of blocks are, but of course, just as with my theory, when he exits with the barkeep through 134, then of course he has to return through that door, and therefore would require block 1 to be present here. Okay, so the observation R is that the room 135 is locked. That's indicated by the teal color things here. Therefore, the only entry and exit is through 134. So any theory which requires him to leave the room must do so through room 134. Now, in the strictest sense, there is the possibility, however remote it is, that because of the way the door lock works, he could have slipped out the door in a way that's undetectable, but it's so low probability that I just have left it off the radar. Okay, so I think I've explained pretty much everything on this chart. The only other thing to note here is that when I put the gray marks up here, this can be read as these are the blocks that are going to be required at the end of the time frame, which is the end of the doors up here. So this can be read as either block A or B, the order doesn't matter, occur right there in the blue thing. And same for this, they occur in the blue box. But up here there will only be one ordering that's possible, and that's A. Alright, let's move on to the next slide. Here's the same diagram, just blown up so that you can get a better picture of it. Now, what does all this mean? Well, when you put it all together, let's go over to the Well, in this case, I've shown path sequence A1, which is my preferred theory. So in this case, the purple highlights the path that he must have taken for my theory to be valid. So in this case, he's in the hallway, makes entry into room 135 as seen by the 5B card being accepted and the door open, and then he immediately throws the deadbolt, locking the door open as the purple line indicates. And then he did a few things there in room 135, and then he made a transition via the adjoining doors over to room 134. He released the deadbolt there, he opened the door, and he left. And then a few hours later, several hours later, he would come back via the hallway and make entry through 134. So that's the purple path. And in this chart, you can see that the red indicates a room transition via the adjoining doors. The purple lines here, reddish purple, indicate that the room 134 had the deadbolt thrown. In the B sequence ordering, it's a smaller time because they were released earlier. The amount of time that the door was locked open on 135 is short in this sequence, is longer over there, and you can see there are, when the door openings and everything occurred. And actually, in this case, this little green path will become of interest later, but for right now, if we're just looking at path A1, it is not relevant. At the very bottom here, you can see that this side on the left presents 3 possible paths. The side on the right presents 2 possible paths. And there's 1 in common, which is 2 in common, which are exiting barkeep and staying inside. And you read this as, if you exit through sequence A, you must make entrance through sequence 1. If you exit via the barkeep, you must make entrance via sequence 1. And if you stay in the room, you must execute sequence 2, which are right here as listed. And then in another diagram at another time, in another video, I'll present those. Okay. Let's see, what else have I not mentioned here? Oh, you can see the little blue boxes around those things. Up here, they represent 1-minute time frames. This is a several hour time frame, and this is, again, back to minutes with an undetermined length. Here, we indicate all the possible paths as presented by staying in the room until 2:05 p.m. And there are 2 paths, A2, and actually there's more than 2, but 2 primary ones, 8 paths A2 and B2. Path A2 makes entry with the ordering of blocks in A, just as my theory does, but rather than exiting the room at this opportunity, he stays in the room, the barkeep comes in, he ignores it for whatever reason, and then ends up in block 2 sequence. That's path A2 sequence. But also B2 is available here, A2 and B2. B2 starts the same way as always, makes entry, but then immediately shifts to room 134, and for whatever reason, looks out the door, opens and closes, reason, not getting into reasons here tonight. And then he either makes a transition, he makes a transition to room 135, and he can do it either through the hallway, since the room for 135 is locked open, as indicated by the purple, or he can make it by walking through the adjoining doors. Either way, he ends up in room 135, and of course now he's got to stay there because the last thing that occurs are events from room 135. And again, he stays in the room until 2:05 p.m. All right. Now, I'm not going to go through the paths for the barkeep options because you can work them out for yourselves. Everything's included in this diagram to do so. So let's see. All right. So where does that leave us? Oh, one other thing. The purple things on the left over here indicates regions of activity that are not in the final fit report. So as you can see, for us, for this region of interest, nearly all of it is not in the fit report, which raises some more questions. So in summary, there are multiple viable interpretations of the lock interrogation report for the time frame of September 30, 6:12 a.m. through 2:05 p.m. And the major ones are that he stays in the room till 2:05 p.m., or he leaves the room at 6:13 a.m., or he does the hybrid thing of staying in the room till the bell hop. Well, that's wrong. Until the barkeep comes along at 12:15, and then he exits with him, and then he'll again, have to come back in through room 134. So pick your favorite. In another video, I'll go into great detail as to the pros and cons, the advantages and the disadvantages, the requirements, the footsteps, and all those favorite things. And I'll even produce graphics like I did in Hunter Chronicle 5.